Welcome to Lighten Up, a show about bringing more love, light, and joy into your life, and archived on the Lighten Up program page. Now the host of Lighten Up, Isabel Merians.
Welcome to Lighten Up with Isabel, your good news show. And we have lots of good news today and also a lot of controversial news. One of the best parts of the program is having a wonderful guest. Welcome, Athena Victory. Athena is a mythologist, a teacher, an actor, and an Olympian, and very knowledgeable about women's affairs. This is our second program in the Woman Invictus, Woman Undefeated. And I welcome all of my viewers from here in America and around the world. Athena, it's wonderful to have you here today, my dear.
It is an honor to be here.
Well, you are certainly well equipped for this program. One of the things that I want to bring out is that here in America, there is something that is really very promising, and that is that there are more women professors, more women religious leaders, more women CEOs, women who own their own businesses. This is all an uptick, and I'm very grateful to share that good news. But yet, as you know, there's also
the idea that women cannot be paid equally with men, and that if they say something in Congress, they need to be silenced.
Yeah, and the other thing is there's still millions of women in this country who still live in fear of their own husbands and boyfriends, who are beaten and who are, abused, and I think that has to be addressed. I've heard the line before that you can tell about a country's, the degree of their civilization by the way women are treated. I'm sure you've heard that line as well.
I have, and civil rights in general, when you make part of your population less than the rest of it, and in here we definitely have a white male supremacy going on, and even further, white male Christian supremacy going on, where women in particular are considered lesser or less equal, and the darker their skin is, the more they're
demeaned. Well, it's interesting because yesterday in the New York Times there was a major article written called "Where is My Name?" and it addressed the fact that in Afghanistan many men call their wives their goat or their chicken. So in other words, the women don't even have the basic respect of having a name.
There's similar taboos with other cultures too. I think in some of the Orthodox Jewish and again in some of the Muslim countries, if you have, say, Hillary Clinton, they won't put a picture of her in their newspaper, and they won't even list her first name. They'll always use her last name. They don't. It's sort of like erasing women from history when you do that.
Right. Well, I mean, to deny a woman her own name, I thought that was pretty amazing. So anyhow, I feel we've got a long way to go. Around the world, obviously, America supposedly as a democracy is more equitable in their treatment of women. And yet, the Republican congressmen who have declared their war on women, are a really major factor right now and really something to be dealt with.
And they basically are literally hitting below the belt. They're going against women's reproductive rights, our right to control pregnancies,
yes,
and also enabling rapists to have control of our lives. In Arkansas, and this just got struck down, they literally were going to have a bill passed. Again, it got struck down. They're not doing it now.
Thank God.
That a woman had to notify, if she got pregnant, her rapist if she intended to abort the child.
How crazy
and
is
in
that?
a lot of, there's craziness in a lot of states as it is. I think in over 30 of the states, if the even if the rapist finally gets arrested and goes to jail and everything, goes through the court system, he still has possibly visitation rights. This puts a criminal, someone who committed assault on somebody,
Yes.
into her life using the child as a weapon.
It's absolutely insane. Well, how dare they? How dare a group of men in Congress think that they have the right to legislate what a woman does with her own body? I mean, just think about that. It's absurd.
And they deliberately bypass the idea that, well, we have some women congressmen that are Republican. How about we invite them to the table and talk about this too? They were shut out of all the conferences.
I know. And many of them were denied the right to speak on different bills. Well, thank God there were two that stood up with Senator McCain, and managed to nix the Republican health care bill. So that at least was hopeful. I find that the Republican war on women is a sustained, unrelenting attack on women's health care. And the president has recently pushed through what's known as, well, it was in effect before, but it was called the Global Gag Order. And what it is a fund of American money that is supposed to be used all around the world to aid women's clinics and healthcare centers. And Trump managed to enlarge the gag order, and it took $8.8 billion out of aid for women, which is just absolutely horrific.
Yeah, that he widened it. I mean, this is something GOP presidents have done all along. As soon as they get a chance, they're in there. It's like, all right, let's cut this funding overseas. But to make it even more onerous, they're taking away not only a woman's right to choose, they're taking away prenatal care, they're taking away mammograms of cancer screenings.
Right.
There's a lot more to women than just
the baby.
Just the baby, just having
Right.
a fetus in her. There's a whole package here. Yeah, and it needs to be looked in. And we had one GOP official said, well, I don't have any need for a mammogram. What do I care kind of attitude.
Yeah, really.
So I'm thinking, you don't have a mother, you don't
A
have
sister,
a
a
sister,
daughter.
some woman in your life. And no wonder you're like sad and lonely and cranky.
Well, while he was in office, Congressman Boehner rammed through a bill that would weaken the Violence Against Women Act. So that's another assault from there. In the first 4 months of 2017, 31 abortion restrictions were enacted at the state level. I'm sure you're aware of that. And the Republican war on women goes beyond abortion, as you said, into birth control, access to health care, equal pay, and domestic violence. And honestly, you know, if they start closing some of these shelters, where is a battered woman supposed to go? Where is she supposed to go with her children? What are the effects of that going to be?
See, I've had a little experience with this, having left an abusive relationship once with a child. And I was lucky. I had family I could go to. Not every woman's that lucky. And it also, even by going to family, if the person's abusive, they still have access. It has to go through the court, and if they have to decide if there's going to be supervised visitation or some such thing going on.
Right.
I've worked with Hercules Invictus. We worked in a women's shelter, Strengthen Our Sisters. Mm-hmm. And Hercules played a role-playing game with the children. And a lot of them had they were kind of scared of men, considering what happened. And he was able to give them a more positive role model and
great.
Confidence, because I had the younger ones I was reading to. So I was reading stories. Mm-hmm. And there was a little boy who was the only one that was really interested in me reading it. And he loved it. I read the entire Bernicula series to him practically. And I said, let's see if you could go upstairs. And he was a little shy. And his brother and sister were downstairs. And I got him to go upstairs, and he wound up leading the group. He had excellent decision-making skills. He was able to interact, and they were able to work as a group instead of, I don't know if you know it, but usually when you start role-playing with children, the first thing is let's try to all kill each other. And it takes a while.
I didn't know that.
Or any monster we see. But after a while, they learn how to work together. So it does teach them how to be sociable.
Right, well, that's good. Well, my granddaughter worked at a women's center when she was in college. And what they did is they paired them up so that she had one woman that she worked with all the time. And they became very good friends. And at a later point in her college experience, she took classes with women who were in prison. And she said the stories were just literally unbelievable. How some of these women, just to survive, had to feed children, had no man in the family, and so they had started selling drugs out of desperation. And, she said some of them were extremely bright, and she ended up babysitting, actually, for some of them, or, helping them out when they were out on, for their good behavior, whatever they got time out for. So, I think what has to happen now is more and more women have to come together and understand that it is with cooperation that there's power rather than with domination, which has been the male paradigm for a long time.
Yeah, women shouldn't be in competition with each other. Because when you look at the prize, it isn't usually worth it anyway. It really isn't.
I think that's something that is an age-old thing, that women are taught to fight over a man. They have to look their best at all times. This is something that's kind of been drilled into them. I've heard women make the statement, I would never vote for a woman president here in America. Well, what kind of thinking is that, So we have to get all women on board, and there's certainly many men who are very fine and very helpful and very much pro our cause.
Oh yeah, by all means. Men can be feminists too.
Absolutely.
All you are doing, you're not saying that you want to be a woman.
No.
You're not saying that you're weak or anything else. What you're saying is that you believe your fellow human being has the same rights and privileges as you do.
Absolutely.
And it's a chance for equality. And that's what feminism is basically about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is that the concept, we talk about America as this great democracy. And of course, when our European ancestors first came over here, when Columbus and his group first showed up, what happened was that they had never experienced democracy before, because democracy was not something that was part of their experience. In Europe, you were probably a serf, or you were overseen by a wealthy landowner or the king or whomever it was that was in power. But the people who came to America had never experienced democracy. And they first learned about it through the Iroquois Federation, which was a group of Indian tribes that had banded together for their own personal greater good. And in the Indian society, the women were totally equal. It was one vote, one person, male, female. And so our founding fathers took the concept of democracy from that. However, they forgot the part about the women. And that's why it was such a long fight for the suffragettes and so forth.
Well, even with the ancient Greeks, we say that, especially in Athens, that's where democracy was born. But it was a limited democracy. You had to be a male of 30, and you had to be a male like 30 years or older. It didn't count women, didn't count slaves.
Yeah, it didn't count slaves. They still had slaves, so that's not really a democracy.
Yeah, democracy is really something that has to be worked on and again, you have to think of equality when you have democracy.
Absolutely.
The United States has a democratic process, but we're a republic. And this is sometimes what doesn't work out for us, because sometimes our representatives aren't saying the will of the people. The only there's checks and balances either way. I mean, even if it was a perfect democracy, you might still have the problem with populism, that somebody just grabs everybody's attention and gets in office and are really not suited for the job.
Well, in looking at these new draconian laws that are being proposed about women, they contain criminal penalties and fines to scare the doctors away, because if a doctor performs an abortion, he's liable under the law, if this goes through.
Well, this is worse. There are laws in several states now. I think it's Texas, Ohio, and Indiana. They're either trying to do this or they've already done it, that if a woman has a miscarriage, she's being investigated for, I guess, manslaughter or some such thing. And miscarriages happen.
Of course.
Especially if you're older, an older woman can have it. I've had 2.
Wow.
So it's like before I had 2 children. It's a horrible process that you have. But they want to also make it harder for the woman. Not only that she be investigated for possibly foul play, that her fetus didn't make it, that they want the remains buried and have a funeral for it.
Oh my God.
Which is, if you've ever had to plan a funeral, and I know a lot of people on GoFundMe now that got caught by surprise, they're expensive.
I'm sure.
And the fetal tissue isn't thrown in a landfill. They've used the fetal tissue from these miscarriages and even from abortions sometimes for research to try to prevent
the same thing
from happening again.
To another person.
The tissue is valuable that way.
Of course.
But it doesn't help anyone if you're forcing a family who's already grieving and feeling bad that they lost the baby to go through this.
That's ridiculous. It's just totally ridiculous.
It's another control mechanism.
So, one thing that's always been a puzzle to me is when men say they have the, quote, God-given right to dominate women. Now, I want to know what God gave them that right, because I don't think it was my God, and I'm sure it wasn't your God.
Nope. I believe it's called the rule of the phallus.
I'm not sure about that.
It's like, we have one and you don't, so too bad.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Well, unfortunately, I think that hung Freud up, too.
Yes.
And I think that was later disproved as being invalid. But I think that in looking at all of this with some degree of objectivity, the question is, when did politics and religion collide and then collude? At what point in time did that happen? I mean, I know it happened thousands of years ago, and certainly when God was worshipped as female, and that was in place for thousands of years before Judaism and Christianity and Islam. But when those people were overthrown, that may have been the initial collision, the Big Bang Theory in this whole unfortunate set of circumstances. Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's correct. And also, politics and religion are sort of like, I guess, lovers that every once in a while come together and what they make isn't necessarily good. And then they'll go away from each other for a while, and then they'll start to courtship again. For example, if you want to go to around the fall of Rome, at first they weren't too crazy about Christians. What probably wasn't as extreme as some of the myths we have about that time. But they didn't have the same, I guess, privileges as the Jewish community there. The Jewish community didn't have to erect a statue of Augustus, say, because their God forbade that sort of thing. Right. And we didn't want, the Romans we're not happy about that, because to them a statue of the god or goddess or the emperor was part of your civic duty.
Right.
So that was already mixed. It was already kind of a theocratical bent to it. Mm-hmm. When the Christians came, they weren't about to let them get away with it. Not have any image of the emperor just so they could put a cross up or whatever, or a symbol of a fish. They weren't going to get away with it. The Christians eventually managed to go from the people and it was a people's religion at first, into the higher ups. And this is where you always get religion working its way into being a theocracy.
Right.
They start getting into the upper classes, and then they finally got an emperor to buy it.
Well, Constantine was the one who spread Christianity throughout the known Roman world, which was extensive at that time. He supposedly had a vision of a cross in a dream, and he felt that if he had a banner with which to go into battle with the cross upon it, that would help him secure victory. And he did win that battle. And then that was the beginning. It became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And what's amusing is that the pagans, the word comes from pagani, which means country dwellers, were the small villages where the word of Jesus had not yet reached. So I thought that was kind of an interesting evolution of the word pagan. So I think there is hope, and we have to be focused on the positive, particularly on this show, as you know. Since the Women's March is in January, after our president's election, thousands of women have expressed the desire to run for office, which is a good thing. My same granddaughter who worked in the prison is now part of an organization called Emerge America. And Emerge America, what they do is they take young women who are interested in running for office as Democrats. They give them 6 months of training, and they have run 90-some-odd candidates so far. And of those 90 that they have run, 72 have been elected, which is quite amazing. Of course, that's at a local level, you know, whether it's town council or whatever. But I think this is very promising. So we need more of that type of grassroots movement, because you saw almost none for Hillary.
There were some very vocal women out there for Hillary.
Oh, there were some wonderfully vocal women, but the grassroots movements that you saw for Obama did not come out for Hillary in the same way,
No.
and that was unfortunate. So I think what we have to do is we have to have more women warriors come forth. Now, throughout history, there have been famous women warriors, as we know. Cleopatra. And remember that these women warriors often had to utilize the same tactics that a male king would have utilized, whether it was, it was Cleopatra the Seventh. The one we know as Cleopatra was actually the seventh from the Macedonian line.
And the last of the Ptolemies, I think.
Yes. And then, of course, there was Boadicea,
Mm-hmm.
and she was from your part of the world.
Yes.
She was actually a queen of the Iceni people in England, and when they were conquered by the Romans, her husband, who was a king, thought he would do a civilized thing and negotiate with the conquerors. And they showed their great appreciation by killing him, by raping his wife Boadicea.
And her daughters,
and
too.
her daughter, they raped the daughters and they scourged her publicly.
And she thought very much, well, if my husband's dead, that means I'm in charge now. And the Romans said, no, you're not.
Yeah.
And so that she was one of the few, if not the only, one to unite the Celtic tribes
Right.
together. And they pretty much burned London to the ground at one point.
Yeah, and they defeated an entire Roman legion. But of course, Rome was a far greater power, and she was eventually overcome. And rather than be taken and publicly humiliated, she killed herself. And then there were other, famous women warriors in history.
You have women defending their homeland, like Boadicea. In Lemnos, if you ever go to Isle of Lemnos, there's a statue of Marula, and it's this woman holding a sword. And the story about Marula was, I believe, in the 14th century, the Turks were overrunning that part of the world. And there was a fortress there that she was defending, or her father was defending. And one of the Turkish soldiers killed her father right in front of her. So Marula rushed forward, grabbed a sword, pretty much ran him through, and led the charge against the Turks. And it made the Greeks fighting feel like
There was a leader.
there was a leader that we have hope, we can
Right.
do this, and it got the Turks to leave. It didn't last. It only lasted like a few years, and then the Turks came back because they were very persistent. But they're still, to this day, she's a symbol of heroism on the island of Lemnos. And you could go there to the statues there, and then there are steps going down into the earth, which is a very ancient
Feminine symbol.
Yeah, and Lemnos, by the way, is one of the islands the Amazons were on.
Right.
So,
And let's bring up the Amazons for fun.
okay.
We just recently had a wonderful film called Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman is the first of the big screen female action heroines. And so that was great fun. You saw that film, right?
I loved it.
It was
I
great
really
fun.
did. She was absolutely amazing
Yeah,
in the
did a
role.
great
and
job.
it was the Wonder Woman that was worth waiting for.
There you go.
And by the way, it's like Linda Carter, who did the TV series, is a lovely, lovely person. She's on Facebook. I've seen her, on there doing posts, and she's very active in activism for
Women's-
women too.
Good, that's wonderful. And I think now is the time that the warrior spirit of women has awakened. Because if nothing else, this administration, the current administration, has fired action before people who had never done anything politically, who were pretty disinterested, really. I mean, if you ask them honestly. And all of a sudden they're fired up and they're willing to take action. It's also interesting that Athena, who was the daughter of Jezebel in biblical times, was the only female to ever rule Israel alone, and she ruled for over 6 years.
And still they had to refer to her as a king
Yes.
rather than a queen.
Yes, because that was the title. The
Well-
title was king.
Well, some of the goddess names, like Astarte, got turned into Astaroth and
Right.
became male demons. They couldn't even say they were female demons. They were that bugged out by it.
Well, there's obviously always been a fear of the feminine. So I think now what's happening is that spirit is awakening again. And women are stepping forth and making their voices heard. And many men who are empathetic to the cause are doing the same thing. So I'm grateful for that. Now, quite appropriately, McCain and the two senators, Collins and Murkowski, have been lauded and praised as heroes for sinking the Republican health care bill.
Mm-hmm.
But no less courageous were thousands of protesters, many of them women, who demonstrated against the bill. And many of these people were arrested and removed from congressional offices. Some were even in wheelchairs. So they are unsung heroes, but heroes nonetheless, that they had the courage to do that, to go to the congressman's office and protest.
Well, you're talking about people that are so cowardly that they won't even do town hall meetings anymore because they don't like people saying, we don't like what you're doing.
Well,
They're basically being told to their face, we don't like what you're doing, by their representatives that they're
Right.
supposed to represent.
Right.
And they don't, they say, well, I'm not going to do town meetings anymore because people just yell at us. But there's a
Well,
reason they're yelling at you. Would you ever think
yeah.
of that?
Yeah, really and truly. Well, hopefully this program will be seen by a lot of people and it will strike a chord. But I always like to leave on a positive note. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do we proceed from here? What is the next step? And to be sure that I didn't forget any next steps, I wrote them down. So I'm going to actually read this, which I rarely do. And the first step that I wrote down was stand with Planned Parenthood. You know, they've been defunded largely. 2, join a grassroots movement. 3, stay informed. 4, call your congressman or text him. Those calls make a big, big difference, believe it or not. and they've actually jammed the phone lines in Congress at different times. Create an effective online position. This is something that's a relatively simple thing to do, and have people sign it. Speak out online, because today, with the telecommunications world having changed so dramatically, and the different sources that are available to us, whether it's the email or the Twitter or whatever, can be used very effectively in this way.
And I'd like to add on that too, because I do this on Facebook very, very often. If you see a headline that's very emotional, impacting, chances are it's from a source that leans way to the left or way to the right.
Right.
Check them with something like PolitiFact. Check them with something like Snopes, and make sure it's a true story.
Right.
I mean, they'll say, well, so-and-so said this, and it was howlingly stupid, and everybody jumps on it, and it's not for real.
Yeah.
Go to something like Reuters or the New York Times or the New Yorker, or something that you're certain will be a little... They might have the news a little bit later, but at least they're going to verify it before they put it up there.
Right, they'll be accurate. The Washington Post is another one. Another thing to do after speaking out online is to email your politicians. Let them know how you feel about their performance. Many of the Republicans are obviously concerned about re-election, and let them know of your displeasure. Number 8 is vote. Number 9 is write a letter to the editor. If you feel strongly about something, write a letter to the editor. It just might get published. Number 9 is volunteer. And number 10, if you can afford to, donate money to your favorite organizations that are making a difference. Become a woman warrior. Take your rightful and equitable place in a democratic society. We will be women invictus. We will be women undefeated. Thank you for viewing it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
Until next time, remember to live a more joyous life. Lighten up.